Hello and welcome. So in this video, we'll be talking about the cell membrane and membrane transport, so how things move across the cell membrane. So if you recall, all cells are surrounded by a cell membrane or a plasma membrane. Those words are interchangeable. And even some of the membrane-bound organelles, if it's membrane-bound, that means it has a membrane. So membranes are really important when we're talking about cells and living things. Now, cells need to get things in and out, right? Because they need to function properly. So they need to maintain a homeostasis. So things like oxygen need to come in. Things like carbon dioxide and other waste products need to go out. Water needs to come in. Okay, so we're going to talk today about how the cell does that. Now, before we get started, it's important to note that a lot of the images that are shown with plasma membranes look something like this. And it's important to keep in mind that this represents just a segment of the membrane, but the whole membrane is surrounding the whole cell, right? So it's completely enclosing the cell like a sphere, right? Like an eggshell kind of, encompassing the entire cell. So when we're looking at something like this, it's just like a snapshot of a piece of that membrane. Just remember that it covers the entire cell, right? So a lot of times you'll see pictures where it'll say outside the cell on one side and inside the cell on the other side. So that's important to consider. All right, so let's get into our membrane transport. First, let's review membranes, right? So first of all cells have a cell membrane or a plasma membrane. Their function is that they control what enters and exits the cell to maintain an internal balance called homeostasis. Right? We want a balance of oxygen, carbon dioxide, salts, water, glucose. Really important to function properly. They also provide protection and support to the cell. And lastly, they're selectively permeable. So this means they allow some molecules in while keeping other molecules out. They're selective, right? They're choosy on what they allow in and out. Okay, so we see things like water and non-charged molecules freely moving in and out, while larger molecules like proteins and glucose, the cell might need sometimes, but it's going to select when it's ready to allow those larger molecules in and out. Same thing with charged molecules and ions. We might need them sometimes, but the cell is going to select when we need those. They can't move freely on their own. And this is just a review of the cell structure. So we've got a phospholipid bilayer, a double layer of phospholipids. We've got some transport proteins, membrane proteins that go through the entire membrane. We've got some carbohydrate chains on the surface. And there's definitely a lot more components of the structure of the cell membrane that we're not going to get into in this class, but know that there are other things. Membranes are very complex. Okay, so now let's talk two types of cell transport: passive transport and active transport. Passive transport does not require energy. If you think like if a person is passive, right, they're a little more quiet, they don't have a lot of energy, they kind of stay in the background. That's kind of what's going on here, right? Doesn't use energy, just happens naturally. Okay, so if you think of standing on a hill with rollerblades on, or roller skates, right? You don't have to work very hard to go down the hill, right? Gravity is just going to take you there. You don't need to exert a lot of energy. Same thing's happening here. Diffusion, facilitated diffusion, and osmosis are types of passive transport. They don't require energy. These molecules just naturally move this way on their own, from areas of high concentration to areas of low concentration. They spread out. It's just how molecules naturally move. The next type is called active transport. So this is the opposite. This is when a cell needs to use energy to transport molecules across the membrane. So this, for example, is like rollerblading up the hill, right? That takes a lot more energy. That's not the way gravity wants you to go, so you have to use your muscles and really push yourself up the hill. Okay? Same thing cells are doing. Requires energy. So some examples of this that we'll cover later in the unit are protein pumps, endocytosis, and exocytosis. All right, so first let's look at diffusion. This is the first type of passive transport, and it is the random movement of particles from an area of high concentration to an area of low concentration. Okay, so think about molecules being very concentrated together and spreading out. That's how they naturally want to move, right? If you think about people on a crowded subway train, right? You naturally just want to spread out and get off that train, right? Same thing's happening here. Molecules do the same thing. Diffusion continues until all molecules are evenly spaced, which is called equilibrium. Okay, so for example, we've got in this diagram a membrane here, selectively permeable, and a small nonpolar molecule that can freely move across the membrane. So we have a high concentration on this side of the membrane. But if we look at our definition, these particles can move from high concentration to low concentration. So what's going to happen here is that these molecules are going to slowly spread out over time to the area of lower concentration. So over time we see these molecules slowly spreading to the other side of the membrane until they reach equilibrium, when they're evenly spaced out. And once they're here, these molecules are still moving around, they're still crossing the membrane freely, but they're never going to all go to the same side. They're not going to all get crowded together in high concentration. That's just not how molecules naturally move. So they're going to remain evenly spaced out until a force is added. So the types of molecules that can passively diffuse across a membrane are neutral molecules, so ones that do not have a charge, nonpolar, and really small molecules. So examples would be like oxygen, carbon dioxide, really small molecules. Next, we have facilitated diffusion. So this is still diffusion. The word facilitated means to help. So this is just diffusion with a helper. So it's diffusion of specific particles through transport proteins found in the membrane. So we're still doing diffusion, we're still moving high concentration, low concentration, but this time we're talking about larger molecules, so they need to move through a transport protein. They can't fit through the lipid bilayer. They need a protein to pass through. So transport proteins are specific. They select only certain molecules to cross the membrane, and they transport large or charged molecules across the membrane that wouldn't be able to go through the lipid bilayer themselves. Okay, sugar is an example of this. Cells need sugar to make energy, but sugar is too large to go across this membrane on its own. It needs to go through a transport protein. Lastly, we have osmosis. So osmosis is diffusion again, but it's the diffusion of water. It's a little different because these water molecules pass through a special protein called an aquaporin. It's essentially an example of facilitated diffusion, but since water is so important to the cell, it has its own name. So it's called osmosis. So when we're talking water diffusion, we're talking about osmosis. So water moves from high concentration to low concentration of water through a special protein called the aquaporin. So water can move freely through these pores, while the solute, it says green, but I forgot to put little green dots here. So the water can move through these, but nothing else can. So a solute like a salt or a sugar or anything else that's not water cannot pass through these. So aquaporins are selective for water. Only water can pass through them. So let's stop and think for a second. What do all three types of passive transport have in common? And how are osmosis, facilitated diffusion different from simple diffusion?